Hello and welcome to this debate on end-of-life vehicles organised by EuRIC, the European Recycling Industries Confederation. I'm Kira Taylor, a journalist at EURactiv, and I'll be moderating today's event as we dive into what is needed to boost recycling for end-of-life vehicles, and we look at the revision of the End-of-Life Vehicles Directive expected this time next year. This Recyclers Talk is part of a series of webinars on the circular economy. If you find this one interesting, you might want to take a look at the one on recycling tyres. You can find that and all past and future events on EuRIC's website and social media. Now, every year, millions of vehicles in Europe reach the end of their life. Around 6 million passenger cars and light goods vehicles were scrapped in the EU in 2018. These cars are processed as waste, dismantled, shredded, or disposed of in another way. During dismantling, spare parts can be taken and used for other cars on the market. The rest go to recycling, is used for producing energy, or is disposed of. But around 4 million cars, or 35% of deregistered vehicles, go missing every year. This risks causing environmental issues, and the EU economy loses millions of tons of materials, according to the European Commission. Alongside this, the End-of-Life Vehicles Directive came into force in 2000, well before Europe's Green Deal, Europe's new Circular Economy Action Plan, or the current focus on electric vehicles. The recycling industry is now pushing for the End-of-Life Vehicles Directive to be aligned with the Green Deal and the Circular Economy Action Plan. That includes measures like eco-design and recycled content targets. So today, to discuss the future legislation and what is needed to bring it in line with the Green Deal, we are joined by several players in the industry to discuss these issues. We will hear from 2 keynote speakers and then move on to our Q&A debate. You can join in by asking your questions via the Q&A function. To submit a question, you can use the Q&A box on the right of your screen, choosing the All Panelists option. Please also to make sure to tell us to whom the question is addressed. Keep those questions coming in throughout the event, and I will try and get through as many as possible. But first, to start us off and introduce the topic, we have 2 keynote speakers. The first from EuRIC and the second from the European Commission's Environment Department. To start, we have Paul Mayhew, who will give us an overview of what is happening today when it comes to end-of-life vehicles and how the directive could be revised. He is General Manager at NBA Polymers and President of EuRIC's European Plastics Recycling Branch. And Mr. Mayhew, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kira, and good afternoon, everybody. Well, I think it feels very apt that we're having this conversation on the back of what has been a lengthy and somewhat laborious COP26 session up in Glasgow. I think it's telling to highlight the challenges of bringing together industry players to make a tangible change when you see the president of the COP26 himself in tears at the end of the session. And I think the challenges that face vehicles are the same as the challenges that face other sectors, such as packaging. And I think it's also telling that at the head of this conversation, we have a plastic recycling general manager heading up the conversation, which I don't think would have been the case had this topic been discussed maybe 20 years ago. But society is changing, and I think people's perceptions and demands on industry are changing alongside that. And we're seeing clearly big leaders in the industry, and I hope members of BMW and Volvo on tour against me, showing some pictures there of their vehicles. But we are seeing some big steps from the leaders of industry to tackle the challenges around the environment. But we're also seeing how hard it can be to get consistency in messaging between different players. At NBA Polymers, and along with some of the other panelists, we are recycling the plastics from end-of-life vehicles. And if we want to see some change, which hopefully the ELV Directive will bring, we need to start looking at those materials that are in vehicles and how they will start to impact going forward. And this clear summary here of the materials which are currently being used in vehicles just goes some way to highlight the role that plastics play. In our facilities, we're receiving these plastics and recycling them. But just like COP26, the true benefit of recycling plastics isn't just on the CO2 savings that happen, but also on the prevention of the depreciation of fossils and valuable natural resources. The good news is we're seeing more and more demand for plastics within vehicles. Had you gone back over maybe 30 years, a vehicle would have been predominantly metal, much higher percentage than what we're seeing today. and that drop-off by weight is being replaced by plastics, and their use is increasing, which contributes obviously to a lower fuel consumption and light weighting. But we need to be bold, and I think that's something that's definitely come out in the last couple of weeks, is we're probably the generation to initiate the change. We don't have time to stand back and wait for change to be put upon us. Within vehicles in general, there is already some exceptional work that's being carried out, but we must do more. And when it comes to using plastics and promoting the recovery and recycling of plastics from end-of-life vehicles, there's the requirement there to really stimulate a stable market. And so EuRIC and myself are calling upon recycled content to be implemented on new vehicles, going from 25% in 2025 up to 35% in 2035. And by doing that, we're creating stable markets for recycled material. It's promoting eco-design, which is a critical aspect when it comes to the ELV Directive, is to ensure that new vehicles are designed with the end-of-life stage taken into consideration. And if we're designing for recycled content, we're often looking for materials that can be recovered and incentivizing as more circular products. And it also goes to rewarding the recycling, plastic recycling, in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions and energy savings, and pulling that demand to the 10 million tonnes, which is in line with the EU policy. So looking forward to the debate and looking forward to the Q&A. I don't want to take up too much more of your time, so I will be handing back to you, Kira.
Thank you, Mr. Mayhew. And our second keynote speaker today is Christian Wimmer, Senior Expert at DG Environment for Waste Management and Secondary Materials. Mr. Wimmer, thank you for joining us. You have the floor.
Thank you for giving me the floor. And, hello to all participants. So, as you know, the Commission is in the process of revising the End-of-Life Vehicles Directive. And this is a process that follows the better regulation principles. In this presentation, there is a challenge that, of course, I cannot share with you what at the end the Commission will adopt in terms of new provisions in the directive, for two reasons. First, we are not yet that far, so there would be nothing I could share with you at this point in terms of policy options we are looking into. We are working hard on it, and we plan to present in a stakeholder workshop in February or March options, including our impact assessment. So between now and then, we face quite a heavy workload. So what I can share with you is our current thinking in the context of plastics and recycling. And here I rely a large extent to our colleagues from the Joint Research Center that into the feasibility of the various options and have developed a SWOT analysis. What are the strengths, weaknesses, threats, and challenges around possible policy options. So when it comes to the strengths, colleagues focused on front runners. They identified that it is possible. Car manufacturers already succeeded to integrate around 36 kilograms of recycled thermoplastics in a car, which shows it is economically feasible at this point. It might be that it also has a reputational that a producer might opt for a high uptake of recycled materials in order to promote the value of sustainability. This brings us basically to what I heard from when I visited recently a recycling plant. It's in the end a management decision. To go for a higher recycling content or not to take this into account. the management decisions, because there's some uncertainty along the price. The break-even of use of recycled plastics appears to be at the order of $60 per barrel. The fluctuations, of course, it's then also a policy decision, so not a management decision, but a policy decision to stabilize the framework that allows the necessary investments in plastic recycling, even in case of lower fuel prices. Now, strengths are value chain partnerships exist. So there are the recyclers, manufacturers, producers, they are all talking to each other. They are interested in long-term relationships, have built them already up. They trust each other. These are all good news. In addition to that recycling of plastics is technologically mature, and when it comes to the regulatory perspective, it's not the new terrain which we are entering by now thinking about, for example, recycling content obligations. We have done the same already for single-use plastics directive. So no worried about what are the practicalities in terms of legal development. The weaknesses, as I mentioned, that 36 kilogram of recycled plastic can be incorporated in a new vehicle, but the reality is that typically 4 kilograms of post-consumer materials end up on average in a vehicle. So there are, of course, limits such as safety concerns. Comes to closed loop, so the recycling of plastics, cars, the age, average age is probably 20 years of a car that is not damaged by an accident. So we talk about also old plastic, with sometimes not full information available on the additives. The challenge when it comes to plastic for cars is diversity, which of course is outside of the regulatory dimension. Many different types and grades are used in a given car. We also see the appearance of composite materials that are challenging to recycle, but then this brings to a legal issue, traceability. How can one find out what is the fraction of recycled plastic in a given batch? The traceability is limited, but it's working on such elements, recycled content, how to address this. And another element is the availability of advanced post-shredder technology. More than 300 shredders in the EU, but to my knowledge, only 7 installations that can separate plastics by polymer by density, and so that's one of the reasons why result in an increase of the use of materials of easy to recycle polymers.
Mr. Wimmer, would it be possible for you to move a bit closer to the mic? We're struggling to hear you slightly. Thank you.
Yes, I give it. So the combustion engine that of course produces a lot of heat is not any longer there. So this is definitely an opportunity, and we expect that an increased amount of recycled plastic is available through other supporting legislation where we have higher recycling targets or the own resources that encourages member states to increase the recycling, and also from a technological perspective, additives, the blending with virgin materials are all options that should make it possible to increase the recycled content in a car. Now, where are the threats? On the one hand, the argument is plastic makes a car lighter when it replaces metal, but what we see at the end, the average weight of a car increases with every year. So we see some rebound effects, and also from the perspective of the competitiveness of our industry, there is a competition with virgin materials and times of lower oil price. This of course makes it more challenging for an industry that is bound to recycled content targets. And I mentioned already the low recyclability of composite materials. So how to address this is definitely very challenging. And then also the impact of recycled content targets on other flows, on other value chains, which want to use recycled materials. So in this context, Commission will develop policy options and will present them, as I mentioned, in a workshop early next year. So that's where we stand at the moment. I'm sorry for not being able to share with you more precise elements of how one could address this topic in the revised directive, and would like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Wimmer. I'm sure we would have all loved a sneak preview into the directive, but understandably you're still working on it. Thank you to both you and to Mr. Mayhew. We can now turn to our panel discussion on end-of-life vehicles. I'm joined by representatives from the car and recycling industry to look into this topic. First, we have Amelie Sophie Sado. She is Environmental Policy Director at ACEA, the European Automobile Manufacturers Association. Emmanuel Katrikis is the Secretary General of EuRIC. Fanny Latour is Program Manager at the Environmental Coalition on Standards, an international network of environmental NGOs. Sandra Torsta is Technical Specialist in Polymer Materials at Volvo Cars. Jules Scollard is General Director of Glue Plastics. And Olivier Francois is Director for Development of the Glue Group and Vice President of EuRIC. Thank you all for joining us. I'd like to remind our audience that they can submit their questions to our panelists using the Q&A box at the right of their screen. Please also include who your questions are for. Now, each of the panelists will give a short introduction on their position to end-of-life vehicles. Mr. Schlollert, let's start with you. What's your approach to this issue, please?
Hello. Yeah. Are the slides going to be shown or?
Sorry, I think it's Amelie Sophie Salo. No? Or...
Yes. We seem to have Amelie's slides, so let's go with Amelie first. Ms. Salo, what's your approach to this topic, please?
Yes, sure. Thank you very much for the floor. So I'm representing the automotive industry today. And if you just go to the next slide, we can see that we had the introduction on the COP26. And also as automotive industry, we believe that a carbon neutral road transport is possible by 2050. And automobile manufacturers want to do their part. And we fully support the aims of the Commission Green Deals. But nevertheless, this is not a challenge that we can face alone. So this is a joint responsibility also with the whole supply chain of the automotive industry. And as already heard a little bit, it is also a seismic shift requiring a holistic approach with increasing efforts from all stakeholders. So if you see on the next slide, you see general aspects of the circular economy. So a car, despite the complexity and durability, is a consumer product with the highest recycling rates today. And automotive products are not easily comparable to any other product like a plastic bottle or packaging. And the global downstream value chain is very different. So we try to make a little picture to show you the durability of an article and the complexity of an article and what this means in terms of circularity and on which topics we still have to work. But the overarching goal is the increase of the use of all qualified secondary materials and the reduce of the use of virgin material from fossil sources and ores. All automobile OEMs in Europe are working on those topics. And as already said, this is also part of a competitive matter. And if you look on the next slide, I have the potential requirements on plastic, perhaps not having a sneak preview, but thinking of what might be in an upcoming legislative proposal. Our main topics today are recycled content targets, material-specific recycling targets, and design for circularity. Those were also topics that were already mentioned. And if we have a look on the next slide, you see the average share of polymer types and current range of recyclates in current vehicles. And what is really important for us is that elastomers and thermosets should be excluded from any target, as potential is non-existent with current recycling technologies. So what we always have to bear in mind that we are producing a car today that will be recycled in up to 15 to 20 years. So this is a very long time range. And the use of textile can vary considerably between OEMs, and it also depends if you have a high-end car, especially what customer requirements are, and customer purchasing premium vehicles are less likely to choose textile on the seat. So there are differences, and no material recycling for wood, cotton, leather, and rubber. And if we have a look on the next slide, the automotive industry is already increasing recycled plastic content. We already heard there were 36 kilograms mentioned by Mr. Wimmer from the Commission. But it must be reasonable and contribute to reduction of environmental impact. And also the supplier base is needed to achieve the goal, and they have to realize also the challenges that we are facing. So we have four main principles when it comes to recycled plastic content, is that we need sufficient quantity in an acceptable quality and the consistency over a defined duration. This is really important for the automotive industry. And also, we will not hide it. It has to have a competitive price compared to virgin material. And if targets are regarded as necessary, we also need a transition period of 5 years due to the vehicle cycles of a car. So we always need a little bit of time to adapt. But what is really important is that you see what I already mentioned, is that we are producing cars today, and even if we adapt the design for circularity, the measures will only be seen in about 10 to 15 years, as the car has then to come back to recycling. So it's not a short to mid-term change that will be seen if we have a design for circularity. So the measures that we have in our cars today will only have effect in 20 years. It's important to always have that in mind. And if we go to the next slide, please. I brought some prerequisites for the recycled plastic content with me today. So we always have the discussion on post-consumer recyclates because they are technically eligible to a limited number of automotive applications due to the high quality and performance requirements of new products. Time and significant R&D efforts are required to increase the potential substantiality. Post-industrial recyclates are essential to expand the use of recycled polymers to visible and technically challenging applications. And any target should be based on technologies and materials that are currently available on the global market. And such a target requires coordination across the entire global supply chain, which entails a large management workload, and perhaps also a development of a UNECE, GTR, or NISO standard with clear global definitions and accounting method is essential to ensure global acceptance. So when it comes to closed loop, we think that there's a large challenge on closed loop. The more virgin or post-industrial material needs to be added to post-consumer recycled plastic in order to fulfill state-of-the-art requirements and competent with new plastic. And also, it was already mentioned that the plastic is in the market about 20 years, so you have degradations and you also have legacy substances in the plastic. So in the future, perhaps also the possibility of chemical recycling would be helpful. And coming to one of my last slides, that's mandatory dismantling. So different polymers, even from similar parts, which are not compatible in the recycling process, have to be treated separately. This immense spaces. We also had a study on that topic. That's the Rumble study from 2020 from plastic parts from ELVs. And many SMEs and ATFs with less than 1,000 vehicles a year have cost of collection of dismantled plastic that will explode by in the future if we come to those things. And I know that my time is running away, so I will just jump to my last slide. And that's about the post-shredder technology. A nation, as already said, post-shredder technology should be increased, and the recycling industry treats vehicle holistically. Changing this approach to assess every single material stream individually may lead to incorrect conclusion, as the value of material fractions in any case exceeds the negative fraction and thus subsidies the entire processes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and that's a great presentation to kick us off. Mr. Katrakis, you're next up. What's your take on this issue?
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to broaden a bit the perspective of the discussion, going a bit beyond plastics, which are obviously a very important topic that have been introduced by Paul Mayhew, Christian Wimmer, and Amélie Sophie Salo. But from a recycler's perspective, recycled content for plastics are an important plea, and I will explain why very shortly, but there are far more other issues that basically needs to be tackled. So in a nutshell, EuRIC is the Recycling Industry Confederation. We represent the recycling industry at large in Brussels. And we have members which are national recycling federations from all over Europe, as well as companies. And we obviously do. And if we go to the next slide, present a number of waste streams. And among others, we represent end-of-life vehicle recyclers, so dismantling and recyclers. And at the same time, also, we are representing a number of tire recyclers. And obviously, tires are being used in vehicles and should be considered as part of the revision as well. Now, if I get back to, so we are working, and I'm going to be also very brief on a number of topics from top-level political priorities to extremely technical matters like standardization, for instance, that will have an increasing importance for all streams, and ELV won't be an exception, especially when it comes to traceability for recycled content, for instance. But if we can go to the next slide, I will just go then and move to what are our key, first of all, assessment and please beyond recycled content for plastic. So first, I think that study made by the OCO Institute back in 2017 says a lot. We do have had a lot of improvements with the ELV Directive, which is a rather old directive that was which entered into force back in the early of the 20th century, in 2000, that had major positive impact on ELV recycling in Europe. Yet we still have problems when it comes to ELV unknown whereabouts, which is a very polite expression to say that we do have a problem since we are losing track of a certain amount of vehicles, which is not a small amount. It's more or less 4.6 million vehicles per year. Those are the numbers for 2014. And out of, as you could see, more or less 14 million vehicles that were entering the end of life stage. So, which were entering the market. So now, why revising the ELV Directive does matter? If we look, if we take a step back, obviously the ELV Directive has contributed to scale up the recycling capacity in Europe, from obviously dismantling, shredding, and post-shredding technologies. So to bring ELV recycling in Europe to, I would say, an industrial scale with a lot of innovation that has been made. That has obviously, a lot of innovation has also obviously come up to achieve high recycling and recovery rates, which are traditionally 85% of material recovery and 10% of energy recovery. But, and that also obviously has to do with my previous slide and other issues that we have been looking at, a lack of harmonization and enforcement across the EU, which brings unfair competition for authorized treatment facilities and the ELV recycling value chain as a whole, and obviously room to improve and to close the loop when it comes to plastics that we have been starting to discuss and that we'll be discussing in the future. Obviously, we need to align the ELV Directive with the objective of the European Green Deal and the New Circular Economy Action Plan. And that requires to level the playing field. I will discuss that in the next slide, as well as to have a better cooperation between the industry that we already have, but I think it can be further improved, and at the same time between member states. So if I try to summarize a bit what are extremely important at European level for ELV recyclers beyond recycled content targets, one is obviously to have a much more harmonized registration and the registration systems across member states to partially and to better tackle the issue of unknown whereabouts. That also requires, that links to that, to a much better enforcement of the certificates of destruction. And here we saw that certain member states, like for instance Czech Republic, which has been linking the insurance premium with the deliver, with basically the giving a certificate of destruction, is a very efficient manner to make sure that there are less loopholes and a better enforcement of the certificate of destruction. And here there is a good study that was made by a national Environmental Protection Agency on incentives for the ELV Directive, and which obviously look at the Czech system, which we think is a good way forward to better enforce the certificate of destruction. Also, the same to avoid illegal exports, have a very practical manner to distinguish between used cars that could be exported from ELV cars that should not be exported outside Europe, to make sure that they are properly treated. And here we think that the best way forward is the implementation of a roadworthiness test to make sure that that distinction is basically based on a test that has to be made to check that the car is able to be roadworthy. Another point that is also very important, and I think we do have discussed that at length, and we have been discussing quite a lot with the car industry, who is undergoing a major evolution, if not a revolution. But one key player that is missing today from the ELV directives are insurers. So, for instance, make sure that when an insurer declares a total loss, there is a link which is made to qualify those vehicles that are total losses from an insurer's perspective as basically end-of-life vehicles. and an appropriate recognition of the role that ELV recyclers has been playing. And I think this comes from a study that was made to support the revision of the ELV Directive, which basically shows that up until now, 88% of all the cost of end-of-life treatment of cars placed on the market come from recycling. And then I just want to conclude because, and also potentially launch a bit the debate that we kick-started on eco-design and minimum targets for post-consumer recycled content of thermoplastics in cars. We fully recognize that cars do have a long lifespan. And obviously the added value, and we saw that for the streams of targets, especially for recycled content, is that they are going basically not only to stimulate end markets, but also give a visibility to invest into current technologies and future technologies to be able to not only recycle, but use recycled content with the right quality, the right quantity, and at an affordable price to remain competitive while being more sustainable than the situation that we're experiencing today. And I'm going to stop here. I wanted really to take a step back, not only discuss about plastics, which are extremely important, but the challenges with the revision of the ELV directives are obviously broader, to be able to give a wider perspective of what recyclers expect from the ELV revision, and pinpoint at the latest paper that we published 2 or 3 weeks ago in relation to the public consultation that ended up on the 25th or 26th of October. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Katchikis, for a brilliant way of expanding the topic, and I'm sure we'll get into many of those topics, particularly eco-design, later on. Next up, we have Ms. Rato from ECOS, the European Coalition on Standards. Ms. Rato, could you give us your approach to this topic, please?
Thank you. Let me quickly introduce you to who we are. So we are ECOS and the Environmental Coalition on Standards. So we are, in a nutshell, we are an international NGO basing our technical expertise on a network of members and experts. And here you can find that we have 52 members across not only national member organizations, but also pan-European member organizations in Europe, and also, as you can see, in the US and other countries. And what we are aimed for, ECOS aims to have a healthy and clean environment protected by robust rules that respect nature and its resources. So we really advocate towards environmentally friendly technical standards, policies, and laws. And as you can see, in the next slides, I will present you what we see what are the main opportunities for improving the circularity of vehicles thanks to the ELVD revision. And so first, we believe that there is great potential into having a single EU regulation, and that is to say, merging the end-of-life vehicle directive and the 3R type approval directive into a single EU regulation. That would help to have both in terms of alignment, but also in terms of coherence from both design phase to the end-of-life stage. And also what is very important is also to have a full alignment with other EU legal acts. Here I've mentioned the Waste Framework Directive, the Waste Electrical and Electronic Equipment Directive, the ROS, CLP and REACH, and let's also not forget the Circular Economy Action Plan 2 objectives like waste definition and recycling definition. And just to give you, for example, what is important is to have the recycling definition aligned throughout the ELV directive. What is then important for us as an NGO will be to push the circular design of vehicles in the revision, first through by ensuring the part repairability and remanufacturing, supporting material and part dismantling at the end of life of vehicles. Also, considering the waste hierarchy, it would be very important to ensure that reuse and preparation areas are considered first, for example, by pushing removability requirements and introducing separate reuse targets at the EU level. Information sharing is also key, as we have seen in other eco-design type regulations for goods, like white goods. And this is important in not only through these types of dismantling requirements and information requirements for to share information with recyclers, but there's also interest in this product passport. And we are very eager to see the European Commission's upcoming proposal, and also a link to the sustainable SPI, Sustainable Product Initiative. So this will be a great opportunity to implement it in the ELV Directive. And in this last point, material recyclability. So we see an opportunity to push for material-specific recycling targets, especially for plastics and critical raw materials. But here, what is most important for us is to push for post-consumer recycled content. Not looking only at the pre-industrial recycled content, but looking really at the integration of and how to push this the integration of plastic that have already been placed on the market. So let's say after the use phase. These mandatory EU targets should be ambitious, and we are very interested in the proposal set put forward by EuRIC. And what is most important as well is to be aware of that we shouldn't cook the plastic books, meaning that we should have really a transparent and trustworthy calculation method that will ensure full chemical and physical traceability of the plastics, and of course discounting processing losses and energy recovery and fuel use. So let's not only be ambitious, but also get the calculation method right. And I would like to give you maybe a hint of also what we believe would be important for tires. We see the opportunity to revise the ELV Directive also as an interesting opportunity to look at tire design requirements. What could be the criteria and management in this new merge regulation for improving the design of tires upfront? What could be required to have a better recyclability, even full recyclability of tires by commercially available recycling technologies, and how we could have them at scale, or we're looking at technologies that are available at scale today. So banning and phasing out harmful and toxic substances. This is valid for tires, but also this is also valid, of course, for plastics in cars, as I mentioned earlier. All these legacy substances that are there, and this is a very problematic issue at the end of life in 10, 15 years, or even 20. So let's look at what could be phased out from the design stage. And for tires, last point is let's have a look at how to set mandatory recycled content targets from end-of-life tires, especially rubbers, bearing in mind what could help to improve their recyclability. Also, looking at how to reduce the microplastics emissions from tire abrasion. So this is also, I didn't mention it, but this is, bearing in mind that tires are the main source of microplastics. So let's have a look at whole opportunities of improving design requirements as well. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A session.
Thank you. And we had a previous event on tires where we really saw some of the issues for that. So if people are interested in that, I really recommend that they go away and listen to that one. Thank you, Ms. Retto. Ms. Torstad, I believe you're up next. Could you give us the car industry's approach to this topic, please?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, and good afternoon to everyone. I was invited 2.5 years ago to EuRIC's meeting and discussing the demonstration car that you can see on the next slide, which were our kickstart to the recycled plastic strategy. There we were aiming for 25% recycled plastics in all new produced cars by 2025. And now we are halfway, so you might be very interested on how we are doing. If you go back one slide, please. We have the kickstart with the plastics were a introduction, and we have learned so much, both internally. We have tested a lot of materials. Normally we we test the requirements on our components, but now we have also tested on material level to learn about recycled plastics, how they behave, and also over time. We have had the opportunity to test a lot of sun simulation, cars, which we have the opportunity to do in-house. And we have learned and talked a lot with recyclers and compounders and component suppliers as well. And one of the greatest things that we take with us during this journey is how important the collaboration within the value chain is, because otherwise we can't succeed by using recycled plastics. Some of the tested materials are put into running production. That was not the goal itself, but we have thought that it is important to do that where it's possible, and we can also learn during that way as well. First, we started with the mechanically recycled plastics, pre and post-consumer. Then, of course, we have investigated chemically recycled materials. Then we also looked into renewable feedstock, bio-based plastics as well, where we see that safety, for instance, is an obstacle for using mechanically recycled plastics. And of course, now for the future, we will also look into CO2 attributed plastics. So future will tell how we will proceed. Also, we have been very involved in research projects where we also learned a lot. And again, the whole value chain has been involved. But this is not only the thing we're doing within Volvo Cars. This was the kickstart for the complete new sustainability journey. So on the next slide, you can see that we have divided this in 3 different pillars, because we have committed to be to the highest standards of sustainability in mobility. Sustainability is as important as safety is for us at Volvo Cars nowadays. So we have climate action, circular economy, and ethical and responsible business. And within each of these, we have different targets. For instance, for climate action, we have committed to be a climate neutral company by 2040, which is very aggressive. Within the circular economy, we should also be a circular business by 2040. And of course, here we are also including using circular materials. And within the ethical and responsible business, we will be recognized the leader in responsible business. And one example here is that we have audits in the mines as well for cobalt mining, for instance, to see that it is done in a good way. Next slide, please. There we can see an example of a good collaboration, again, in the value chain. And this is the facelift for an XC60 inscription this year, a front bumper, where we have incorporated all the black plastics with recycled content. And it's pre-consumer material, varying from 40 to 100%, depending on component. So we have actually the brackets in 100% recycled content. And these are visible, they are grained and ink-colored in our own color. And to be honest, when the bumper team told me that they will put this in production in our most selling car, I was stunned. I didn't really think that we had come so far in only 2 years of work. It's an astonishing work of the team. And the best of all is that I have not been involved in this at any point. And you might think that is a strange thing to say, but for me, it shows that then I have succeeded to teach the teams to ask the right questions and collaborate with material suppliers and component suppliers. So this is a fantastic work of that team. If we go further, of course, to continue our journey, we also have some needs. And as far as I have learned now, we need both pre and post-consumer recyclate to be able to fulfill our ambition of 25% by 2025. I'm saying this because we don't have this circular loops material ready yet. We're working on it for sure. But now, as the situation looks today, the material is scarce already. A lot of companies are wanting to have the recycled materials that is available on the market. The prices is getting higher as well. But also for me, also being in the recycling business for a while, I know that there are so many tons of materials that is not taken care of today. So I thought that with this increased demand and interest of recycled plastic, that material would have been taken care of, but not yet. So I hope that it will, because we need it, and it's perfectly fine to use other types and not only automotive plastics for our new cars as well, if you know what you're doing and put it in the right place. What we also need is relevant standards and definitions, so we can compare and talk about the same things. I know that they are working on definitions right now, and that we have a nomenclature dictionary in the end of the year. So I'm looking forward, hopefully it will come then. I'm looking forward to that. And also, there is a lot of work ongoing in the EU on standards currently, and hopefully we can also engage and be involved in that work as well. So looking forward to the discussions today. Thank you very much.
Thank you for taking us through Volvo's approach to this. We next have Mr. Skolard. What is your take on this issue?
Okay, well, thank you, Mr. Tostar, Madam Tostar, for sharing the view of OEMs. So how does it look for the recycling industry? As you know, there is a mandatory target which is requested by our industry that is due to the fact that if we're looking at the recycled content being used today, it is coming from a technology which is already existing for many, many years. Shredding of parts like battery housings, bumpers, and so on, that is done for, I would say, since the early 90s. If we're looking at post-shredder technology, where we're separating thermoplastics and bringing that back to new car parts, that is done for a couple of companies in Europe already since 20 years on industrial scale. So having recycled content, whether it's in exterior car parts, underbody components, motor housing, or parts in the motor housing component or compartment, it is available today. It has been done. The recycling industry can respond to technical data sheets and can also respond to answers and requests on substance of concern, which is in fact leading us to that conclusion that having that 25% mandatory targets by 2025 as a feasible target. It is not some kind of technology which we still need to develop. It is not rocket science. It is present today. The only thing and the only concern that we have as a recycling industry is in fact that why we didn't go further into this, why we're still seeing that in some countries recycling is done, in ours it isn't. And residue from shredding is still going to landfill, is still going to incineration. It's in fact the uncertainty around having a return on investments. With the mandatory targets, we knew that we can come to having a return on those kind of investments, which means that you will get a great push within the recycling industry to indeed make more material available from post-consumer resources, where eventually we can close the loop a lot more within that 25% mandatory target between plastics coming from ELVs, coming from end-of-life vehicles, and going into new car parts. So we should see, in fact, car shredding residue as a valuable source for new car components, and as something which, as I already highlighted, as already underlined, as something which can respond to technical data sheets, which is of course the first and primary goal of every supplier into the automotive industry. So development can be done. We should incite investments into more post-shredder technology. We should indeed also go further because, of course, when we're looking at thermoplastics today, that is already done, as I said, for over 25 years. Of course, there are other waste streams, there are other plastics as well, which can be found in ELVs. It is something where we can say, okay, if we move further down the line, with a guarantee, with a market being there, we can incite investments also into further separations. But of course, what is this requesting? What is it demanding? That there is a circular design approach. It means that OEMs need to work, and then one should not only see the supplier base as just suppliers of recycled material. So it will be a whole corporation together with tier ones, with OEMs, with the recycling industry, where we can guarantee materials being available and materials responding to technical concerns, but also moving further into, because as I also highlighted, it's a lot of exterior car parts which are made today from even from post-consumer material, from post-consumer recyclates. We can push the burden even towards plastics, which can be used into the interior of cars, but it means investment, it means new technologies and so on. This can be pushed, this can be guaranteed once there is a market available. There is also, of course, a huge concern within with OEMs that recycling targets, recycling content might go against the need to have lightweighting. We're a little bit concerned and convinced that a lot of focus from OEMs went into lightweighting and so on. We need to find a better balance. We need to find a marriage between emission targets, the target to reduce the carbon footprint of cars, but also to have recycling targets being available. And recycling targets does not only mean, as already highlighted, as already suggested, that we should introduce recycled content into cars. It also means that we have to have circularity, that we have recyclability of compounds, of materials being used in new car parts. What does it mean? We should not just put or apply a time lag, because we should not, an OEM should not think, okay, what is not recyclable today can be recyclable within 15 or 18 years time, which is the end of life stage of a vehicle. It means that they should already take into account, if you want to close that loop from an ELV into two new car parts, that what is introduced in cars today also can be recycled. It means that certain additives, certain composites, which of course have an added value in terms of lightweighting, should really be questioned whether it's the best option also go towards circularity. It means that when it's coming to life cycle analysis, we should also question what kind of analysis that we want to make, until what stage that we want to go. It's not just that we say, okay, recycled content is giving a better carbon footprint when we design a new part. It also means that in the end, is the part also recyclable, and can it serve again to make new car parts? Means that circular design can also lead to better analysis, to better focus, that we should come to a conclusion or to redesigning of cars. And this is, of course, not something which is going to be present of today, but where eventually certain parts easier or could be more easily dismantled. Of course, there are two technologies today, and the main technology which has been pushed and promoted is that we should separate plastics after shredding. We can also say, okay, maybe a car should be designed also to have it easily being manufactured, but also to have it easily being dismantled, where parts could be used or in new cars, which of course is a whole circular design approach, but then also to easier being dismantled if a certain part is made from a certain type of plastic, that it can be easily dismantled and shredded and brought again as material into a similar or new car part. Of course, it's an economical question which we have to raise, whether indeed we're going for more shredding or whether we go for more dismantling. But that's once again a lot more cooperation will needs to happen between OEMs, between car manufacturing, but also between the recycling industry. So that is something where a lot more discussions, a lot more focus will need to come, because sharing those kind of dismantling practices, sharing knowledge on how we can recycle more parts, how we can introduce more material into new car parts, I would say is going to be welcome towards all of the industry for a lot more and lot better cooperation than is already happening today. Okay, thanks a lot.
Thank you, Mr. Schwartz, and thank you for explaining the challenges ahead, but also maybe some of the solutions too. Our final presentation comes from Olivier Francois, and Mr. Francois, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Kira, and good afternoon for everybody. Yes, well, I just reviewed the question of this ELV directive on one slide. So this is the slide there. Thank you very much. And I want to point 4 big changes, in my opinion, which is really to be taken into account and to keep in mind with this question of the ELV directive revision. The first big change, in my opinion, is the fact that there will be a merge of the type approval directive with the ELV directive, and this merging of the 2 old directives will be a regulation, which means that it will not be a directive anymore. It means that the transposition in the different country will not be different. It will be a regulation, so it will be the same law for everybody. And this merging of the type approval directive with the ELV directive is certainly a big change with regard to what is called the 3R, reuse, recycled, and the valorization rate, which is looked for the vehicle of the 95% valorization rate. So this obligation to really be efficient in the eco-design of the vehicle, of the new vehicles, which will be launched on the market in the future, with this type approval directive compelling with the reuse and particularly with the recycling obligation, will be a big change. You will say probably that it already exists because the type approval directive is from 2005, so for more than 15 years now. But in fact, it was more or less a theoretical approach until now for the car manufacturer, and this merging of the 2 directives will certainly bring a lot of work for the car manufacturer for the recycling part of the vehicle, and we certainly cheer about such a new way of expecting the vehicles recycling. So it's really a very important choice that the EU Commission made with this type approval directive merging with the ELV directive. The second point, which will be also a very big change, is what the European Commission is calling the fully fledged EPR scheme, Extended Producer Responsibility Scheme, to be as one of the major goals of the new ELV regulation. This is important because until now, there was a co-responsible organization, meaning that the car manufacturer were responsible of the goal of the ELV directive as it existed for 20 years, but all the different steps in the recycling chain, from the dismantling for the depollution, dismantling, shredding, post-shredding, all the different actors were responsible for this, for the goal to be obtained by the ELV directive as it was. This was important because it means, like Emmanuel Katrakis explained in his presentation, that most of the investment, most of the cost for the ELV recycling for the 20 years until now, 88% of the cost were taken by the recycling industry, by the ATF, the authorized treatment facilities, and by the shredder and the post-shredder company. So it's a real big change. If we go to a fully fledged EPR scheme, it means that there will be a kind of different approach, with the fact that the car manufacturer will be only responsible and that the recycling industry will leave, if I can say that, a part or a large part of this responsibility, which I think is not a good way to do that. And the third big change will be the fact that the value of the vehicle in the future will be incredibly higher than as it is today by the end of life. By the end of life of the vehicle, an internal combustion engine vehicle today, the end of life value of the vehicle is something like 100 euro, 200 euro per vehicle. This is what is the material value of an end of life vehicle. When we look at electrical vehicles, the situation is completely different. The material value of an electrical vehicle is incredibly high due to the electric battery, due to the electric engine. There are 4 times more copper in an electrical vehicle than in an internal combustion engine. So it's incredibly different because there will be clearly for the car manufacturer a will to keep the value of the vehicle, and this will lead to big changes in the organization because the car manufacturer wants to recover the value of the material by the end of life. And this will, we can expect a lot of change for the ATF because there will be a kind of competition between the ATF and the car manufacturer to take back the value of the vehicle at the end of life. And finally, last big change is what is now operational on the side of the car manufacturer is that they create a permanent link by internet between the electric vehicle and themselves, which means that the car manufacturer have a permanent information, flow of information. It's 2.5 gigabytes per hour. It's a huge amount of information that the car manufacturer gets on the vehicle because they want to know what's going on the electric battery, but naturally they can keep a contact with the owner, with the owner of the vehicle. So this is a completely new business model that we have to also to take into account. The fact that the car manufacturer gets a permanent contact with the owner, it can give to the car manufacturer a possibility to completely change the way the vehicle is managed by the end of his life. So, okay, those 4 very big changes we can expect for the recycling industry. A lot of different approach, a lot of different consequences as the 20 years we already live in this recycling business. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now we can move on to our Q&A discussion. I can see some questions coming through in the Q&A. Please keep them coming in. Please make sure you use the Q&A function rather than the chat function. It just makes my life a bit easier. I want to start with a question for all of our panelists today. Currently, there is very little uptake of raw materials from recycling in the automotive sector. What is needed in the End-of-Life Vehicle Directive and beyond to change this? Mr. Katrikas, let's start with you. What do you think is needed?
Yeah, first, I think there are 2 things. One discussion that we already have had on basically plastics, which I think the position that EuRIC has been taking on mandating recycled content target to basically pull the demand and also give predictability to the industry and to the value chain to make investments in current and forthcoming technology is an important point. And we saw that for all the streams that has proved to be extremely efficient in scaling up capacities. The other thing is that I think we see it very openly that there is an evolution that the car industry, if not a revolution, is experiencing with electric vehicles that are basically going to replace combustion engine vehicles that are going to have an impact in terms of the very value of the ELV directive, and also the recycling techniques that are going to be used to recover those materials. And here, I think we also need, and this is something that we start to discuss, to balance a bit. On one hand, all the obligations that are related to removability, dismantleability, and on the other hand, the fact that the investment that have been made and that will keep being made to improve dismantling, shredding, and post-shredding technologies that prove to be extremely efficient over the last 20 years will continue to be needed. So there is an evolution, but at the same time, we need to make sure that we are going to value the investments that have already been made and make the best out of them. So really want here to kickstart a bit the discussion, because I'm sure that is going to basically call upon additional comment.
Thank you. Well, Mr. Lou, let's move over to you let's move over to you for the to carry on that conversation. What do you think is needed to boost the uptake of recycled materials?
I think the start of your question couldn't be heard.
What do you think is needed to boost the uptake of recycled materials?
If you want to boost the recycling material, first of all, as I said, it has to be the right material and the right amount of material that is needed for the automotive industry, and we need it over a long period. And so to also boost the outcome of recycled material, as was already said, it's the investment also in the recycling industry, and especially also in post-shredder technology. And just if I come back to the part who is paying what, if you have 88% of the investment, but you have 100% of the revenue, this should also be taken into consideration. So the question of the investments is a big issue for the uptake of recycled content.
Mr. Francois, let's send this question over to you. What do you think is needed to help boost recycled content in the industry?
Well, I think that's the key point is really the demand, as Mr. Scolart explained in his presentation. We absolutely need a demand, and that was what was lacking for the last 20, 25 years. We developed, there's a lot of companies in Europe who developed the possibility to process recycled plastic and to set a good quality plastic, because you can imagine that if we sell to the car manufacturer for now 20 years recycled plastic, naturally we have to compel with the quality which is required by the car manufacturer. But the fact is that since they are not obliged to use them, each time that the cost of the, let's say, the new polymer, the processed polymer coming from the petroleum industry is cheap, naturally the car manufacturer goes back to the cheapest material. So that's during the last 20 years, there was always this game, of up and down. Sometimes the price of petroleum is very high. So, okay, the recycled plastic, there was a market for them. And as soon as the petroleum was beginning to be cheap, and this arrived some I think twice during the last 20 years, suddenly all the car manufacturers, they disappear because they prefer to buy the cheapest material. So there is really there a problem we have to solve at the moment, which is not a problem of price. Because if we just rely on price, there will be no permanent demand on the recycled material. And this is really a problem for investment.
Brilliant, thank you. If I could remind all of our panelists to mute themselves when they're not talking, just so that we make sure that we have the best sound possible. Mr. Scott, maybe let's come across to you. You mentioned this in your presentation, but maybe you could expand on this a bit. You say the technology to allow recycled content in cars is already there. What is needed so that people use that and we can make the most of it and boost recycled content in the industry?
But we will have to work a lot more together, I would say, because technology is existing. It's not really widespread, and it's in fact based on a lack of view on return on investment. Today, if we want to go a lot further, if we proceed a lot more with pushing recycled content, because in fact, you can say there are two options. Or we say we push, and that is done today by a couple of companies. We push recycled plastics for 100%, whether it's going to be post-industrial, post-consumer, or we push a lot more to have the kind of compounds where a certain part of the 1% polypropylene is coming from post-consumer. We can open a lot more doors to respect technical data sheets, and we can respond to a lot more applications within cars. Once again, to do those kind of developments, to do that kind of, it's not only technology, it's also to have to create those kind of plastics. You need to have a certainty that there is going to be a market. Without that kind of guarantee, without that kind of certainty, no one is going to push this. Sometimes making just a short sidestep, but it's what we anyhow saw, and it's mainly referring to the packaging industry. Mechanical recycle, or the chemical recyclers have already announced they're willing to put 7.2 billion euro on the as investment in the market to push recycling within Europe. The second thing they said, or the second thing they mentioned, okay, but then we need a 30% mandatory recycled content target by 2030. We haven't had it for the last 25 years. All of the investments which have been done was just, I would say, almost goodwill from certain companies who said, we're going to invest, we're going to promote recycled plastics coming from ELVs without any kind of guarantee, any kind of return. That's not sustainable.
Thank you. And Ms. Torstell, let's come to you. You mentioned Volvo's ambition to have 25% recycled content in its new cars by 2025. What obstacles do you see for that, and what support do you think is needed to reach those targets?
Well, as I mentioned before, there are limited amounts of recycled plastics on the market right now. We can see it. We have a global production. We would like to have it locally sourced, even though we know that transportation is just a part of the total LCA. So the energy mix of the processing of the material is much more important. But I think that is the main obstacle today, to get the material where we would like it to be and the amount of material available. Of course, we foresee that we are going to be a circular business. We will have new business models coming. We will own our own cars in the future to a much bigger extent than today. And that's why we see that then we will have more control over the material that we put in the cars. But of course, also we see now how should we work to get the material out again? The best way is to not mixing the materials that we are putting in the cars for the common car projects. Try to have as clean streams as possible, and also to put it in a way that we can either dismantle it. That's the best thing, not to try to mix everything in the end and then try to sort it out. It's better to have it in one piece, so to speak. And also we see that all the research that has been done in this area has shown before that it's not economically feasible to do it that way. But I'm convinced that will change in the future for sure.
Thank you. And finally, on this topic, Ms. Rattau, you've had everyone's interventions on this. What is your view on recycled content?
Thank you. We believe that recycled content is a great opportunity for pushing or pulling, as certain consider pulling or certain consider pushing the market towards including more recycled content in vehicles. We understand the difficulties behind what the market, where does it come from? So it's a bit a chicken and egg discussion. Where do we start with? Let's be ambitious. Let's set up these recycled content target for cars, especially because we are talking about long-term and durable products, and that will bring real value for the market, for vehicles. And let's also look at what, as mentioned earlier, what is available as technologies, especially mechanical recycling processes that are efficient existing today. Let's rely on them and see what would be feasible today, but considering also that, of course, these targets need to be met in the next 15, 20 years. So what is important, and I see as well a bit deviation with previous speakers, that we believe that we should really rely on post-consumer recycled content targets. And these pre-industrial targets are, we understand that pre-industrial plastic waste should also be recycled, but there is, as mentioned, these are non-mixed or clean streams, and so these already make business case to recycle. So let's focus on those streams, plastic streams that will come up at the end of life of vehicles, where that need to be dismantled, that need to be properly separated and properly recycled. Thank you.
Thank you. And one other thing I think that we saw today was this discussion on electric vehicles and how the End-of-Life Vehicles Directive may need to change in order to adapt to this new rise in new vehicles. We have a question for Olivia Francois. You spoke about copper volumes to get back from old electric vehicles. Do you know what would be the average volume of recycled copper, or from car recyclers, what could they get and sell on the EU market after recycling? That's from Christophe Chanel. It's very specific numbers you're being asked for there, but could you comment on that?
Yeah. Well, I think I said that the amount of copper which is expected will be 4 times what is now in the internal combustion engine for the vehicle we know as today. So 4 times is quite a high value, but well, most of that will be in the power electric engine, naturally. And the power electric engine is certainly the place where all this copper is. And for what we know as today is those power electric engine will last for a very long time. Some studies expect 100 years of duration for those electric motors. You know, it's something that is completely different from an internal combustion engine. The internal combustion engine, we know that for 15 years after a good use, they are completely finished and they have to be recycled just for the value of the metal, the steel, and the aluminum. But for the electric engine, it's completely different. There is nearly nowhere, so it can be used very long time. So this is the point where the car manufacturer will certainly want to recover those electric engines and reuse them for the second life, a third life, fourth life, etc. A very long-standing life. So I guess that this value, and particularly this copper value, will be in the hand of the car manufacturer, not of the ATF anymore.
Mr. Kachkas, I know you brought in the topic of electric vehicles as well. What is your approach to the topic?
Sorry, I wanted to get back to the previous discussion very shortly, because we tend to focus on plastics, but the plea for recycled content is also valid for all the materials. As I say, and it has been said, it's a way to go a bit beyond the chicken and the egg discussion, because I perfectly understand that from a car producer standpoint, what matters is to have the quantity, the quality, and an affordable price. And for us, what matters is to have the certainty that if we invest, basically, we are going to have the demand at the end of the pipe, regardless of what are the oil prices on top. And this is absolutely why we have been calling for recycled content. This is a way basically to have a much more climate neutral and resource efficient use of materials, since basically the substitutions of oil-based or other types of ores and concentrates that are being used in raw materials is going to bring massive benefits in terms of CO2, resource efficiency, and energy use that are not being priced today or internalized in market prices. Now, we have also worked within EuRIC on tires and the use of basically more rubber back into tires. So I know there are a number of difficult obstacles to be overcome, which will require obviously more work to be done with tire producers. But that work also starts by looking at what is feasible today in terms of targets, what might be feasible in the near future based on the technologies that are being already out on the market to recycle tires back into materials that can be used into new tires, and at the same time do some progress when it comes to eco-design. There are certain types of tires which are being placed on the market today, which are extremely difficult to recycle because they have some properties. For instance, tires which cannot get flagged, so puncture-free tires, for which the composition of the tire itself make it extremely difficult, if not impossible, to be recycled when they reach end of life. And I think here the ELV Directive is also a way to look at other basically streams used in cars for higher uptake of recycled materials. So sorry if I get back to that point. So I.
Mr. O'Toole, you brought up some things about eco-design, and particularly eco-design of tyres. How important do you think it is that the End-of-Life Vehicles Directive, when it's revised, it brings in these types of eco-design measures?
But we support the fact that when merging, there is opportunity when you merge the End-of-Life Vehicle Directive together with the 3R Type Approval Directive, that you consider both the design phase, what can be done from the design at the very early stage of vehicle design, and also you consider when looking at what can be put on the market, you consider also the end of life of these vehicles, of these tires, of these parts and materials, so that you phase, for example, you also phase out those substances that would impede the recycling of the different parts, material parts, plastic, especially plastic parts, when looking, having this circular, hopefully a closed loop recycling in mind.
Thank you. And I think as well we've heard from the recycling industry, and I'd like your opinion on this, maybe Mr. Scott. What do you want to see in terms of eco-design? Because surely anything will only really reach the recyclers in 15 to 20 years' time. How can you predict what you will need at that point?
But of course, it's a difficult question. The only thing what you know is what is available as technologies today and what can be done. As I said in my presentation, I made reference to that the kind of time-lag approach, where sometimes it is said, okay, if you make a certain compound which is not separable today, maybe in 18 years' time, when those vehicles will arrive at the end of life stage, it is anyhow going to be possible. And I'm fully convinced, and I'm 100% believer in technological advancement. But that's something that we should refrain from today. We should look a lot more into the fact that if a certain compound, if a certain material is put into a car, is it also recyclable? Because in the end, as I said, it should not only be about bringing recycled content into new car parts. It should also be the fact that is that part in itself at the end of life state, can it be recycled again? And can we close that loop with cars that materials which are used today also can be used again tomorrow?
Thank you. And maybe Ms. Chauster will come to you about this. What can vehicles do? What can you put in your design phase in order to help eco-design?
Well, you are right. We are working very hard on this right now. And as I mentioned before, it is not to mix material and design them so you can dismantle them in the end of life. And this is also collaboration. We have a good collaboration internally with the design department and the R&D department to make the most out of it and to be able to take care of the parts and the materials in the end of life of the vehicle.
Thank you. And you talked about Volvo's ambition for reaching that 25% of plastic in new cars. What are the main obstacles you see towards getting to that level?
Oh, it's a good question. I think despite the lack of material, as I have mentioned, another thing is that we have said that we should be a climate neutral company by 2040. And by that is that we should reduce our CO2 contribution. And with plastic, that is not always the case of using recycled plastics. Sometimes it collides with that ambition. And then the CO2 target will overrule the recycled content. So actually, it's better for us maybe to change from a polyamide to a polypropylene in primary material than using a recycled polyamide. Then we will save more CO2 by using a primary PP. So for me, that is negative to the recycled plastic ambition, but overall it's good to lower the CO2, of course. So that is a problem. What is the most beneficial for the overall CO2 reduction target that we have?
Brilliant. And Mr. I want to come across to you with this question on eco-design and how the car industry can maybe implement that. And also maybe a question from Nicholas Burster. What are the possibilities of other car manufacturers to maybe take the same path of Volvo and aim for climate neutrality in 2040 or around that time?
To answer with the end of your question, I think every OEM is taking their own strategy, and on association level, I cannot give answers on the different strategies of the different OEMs. But if you have a look in their sustainability reports and in the press release, you see that most of the OEMs are going into that direction. So this is not something that we want to hinder. We have the clear commitment on circularity and also on the Green Deal, but it has to be feasible and achievable. And if we go and discuss about eco-design from an automotive perspective, today already we think that our cars are easy to repair and to dismantle, because when you have a look on the cost of ownership, this is something that is market driven. So we have incentives to already go into the direction of eco-design, and also from an insurance perspective, we have the motivation to go in those directions. What is clear that there is always room for improvement, and as said, it has to be done as a joint effort over the whole supply chain, and we need also the materials and the supplier to help us achieve that goal. So it's nothing that the automotive industry can just do on their own.
Thank you. We have another question from Jan Bollen for Mr. Francois. Again, you're popular in the Q&A today. Will fully fledged EPR, so extended producer responsibility schemes, with co-responsibility not only apply between organizations, but between materials in ELV being processed?
Yes, I saw the question. It's a difficult one, because what I mentioned in my presentation is that until now, during the 20 years of the ELV Directive, we practice this co-responsibility, which means that the management of the ELV recycling was really something which was shared by the car manufacturers and the recycling industry. There was a real sharing of the goals, and even if the costs were mainly supported by the recycling industry. What Jan Bollen suggests, I think, in his question, is that there is always a competition in the material which are used in the vehicle, you know. And okay, that's something that is relatively difficult for the recycling industry to take into account, because we are not the car manufacturer. The choices of the material, for example, we mentioned, I think, at the beginning of the recycler stalls, the lightweight of the vehicle and the research of lightweight. So naturally, there is a competition at this point on the different material, the steel, the aluminum, which is very light, and naturally the polymer, the plastic, which are very light too. So there is always a competition there. And it's difficult for us to really intervene as a recycling industry on that. We naturally fight for materials which are easily recyclable as an industry. Like Emmanuel Katrakis told, there is not only plastic, and I fully agree with Jan Bollen. The steel must be taken into account, because it's a very important material. It gives a lot of important properties with safety, for example, in the crash test of a vehicle. Naturally, the steel plays a very important role. So there will still be a very important role for materials like steel to be taken into account in the future, and we hope for that. it's really a question of equilibrium between the different material, and this is typically a question which are in the hands of the OEMs.
Thank you. And we had more comment than a question, but I'll endeavour to change it into a question from Kevin Bradley. If the car industry is to seriously take on the challenge of closing the plastic loop, then the target plastics have to be from end-of-life vehicles. So the regulatory target has to ensure this, otherwise you will have what is occurring in the textile sector, where they are competing with the beverage industry for PET. Maybe I'll take this to Ms. Torster. When you are looking at bringing in this recycled plastic into your cars, are you looking at bringing it from old cars, or are you looking at maybe other sources for that?
It's a very good comment. Now, of course, we would like to use from old cars. The material are there today, but limited as well. So we are looking into all different sectors to be able to get the right material that we need for our cars. But as I said, it's a really good comment, because should we take, for instance, PET bottles from a closed loop and use it in our cars? Questionable. As far you can see it from the angle that then it will be in the car for 15-20 years. It's a long lifetime for that material as well, then compared to a bottle. But it's up for discussion for sure. But from now or for this time period, we use different kind of packaging material and what we can use. I mean, it's the right properties that we need for the components, basically.
Mr. Shaw, what's your response to that? Because you're coming from the people who would be supplying the source for that.
But of course it's true. So it's something that we need to look, and then we need to roll out a lot more. That's the push shredder technology to separate plastics into cars. As I said, it's only a handful of companies which is doing that today. So there are two main things, or two main activities in terms of recycling of parts from end-of-life vehicles. Of course, you have companies who are dismantling certain car parts like bumpers and are shredding that and bringing that back to plastics to reintroduce again into new car parts. The number of companies doing really like that post-shredding technology, where plastics are separated in the end, you will have new recycled thermoplastics, which can be used as polypropylene in new car parts. Only a handful of companies. A lot of it is still going today into landfill of incineration. But it's the same bottom line once again. Why are those companies not investing today? Because there is no guarantee of a market. If that guarantee is there, I'm really convinced, I'm really sure that we will arrive a lot more at recycling end-of-life vehicles for plastics.
Thank you. It feels a bit of a chicken and egg problem at the moment. Where do you get it and where do you not get it from?
I would not say it's not chicken and egg, due to the fact that because if you would have chicken and egg, then I would say we have to develop a certain technology to be there. As I already mentioned before, the technology is already existing. The only thing that we have to do is, and we have discussed about PET, you can make a whole business model around PET. Why the whole PET? And there is a competition today between consumption of PET into various applications, because in fact there is something looming where there is an obligation in 2025 that you will have PET recycling needed, because you're going to close that loop with 25% in new PET bottles. That's the kind of incitement that we need for investments. And that will also disclose, because also if you look at pricing for PET and then recycled PET, that is a constant market. Even though there is a guarantee that we'll have a certain price, it is a guarantee not only for price and that kind of price and volume, and that is of course the incitation or that you need for investment.
Brilliant. Thank you. And thank you to everyone who sent in their questions. Apologies, we couldn't get through more. We now need to round up. And to do that, I would ask each of our panelists to give a short, maybe 2-minute introduction or takeaway from what we have seen today. So, Mr. Scholler, maybe let's start with you. What has stood out for you today?
Well, I would say that it's a very interesting discussion, and we know, of course, that we have to marry a lot of objectives here, and there are a lot of obstructions within this market. I've seen that question around, is the recycling industry against composites? Of course not. The only consideration that we have to do until so far, circularity in terms of design. Even though I heard Madame Tostar, and it's really nice to hear that Volvo is making those steps to reach there. I think that lacked a little bit. There was a lot of focus from the automotive industry has been on lightweighting, has been on developing materials, composite materials, to make cars lighter, even though that was not always circular. To close the loop with the ELV recycling. I think that's a major step that we have to do, and there is going to be a whole transformation. There is going to be a whole transition in the market. I think we will have exciting times ahead. It's not always going to be easy, and of course there will be difficulties as well. But I think we will reach a lot more circularity in the coming years.
Thank you, and Mr. Francois, maybe you next. What are your key takeaways from today's debate?
Well, I think the main problem we are facing with this ELV Directive recast is the fact that, in fact, and particularly with the type approval directive, which is merging with the ELV Directive, is that we are merging two questions which are so different, you know. We have today 280 millions to be precise, and vehicles which are circulating in the European Union. Those are internal combustion engine, but it's quite a lot, 280 millions of vehicles. So we have in front of us 10 years, 15 years of recycling, which is exactly as we did during the last 20 years. And at the same moment, the ELV Directive is planning what will be coming, like Ms. Salo explained in his presentation, what will be coming in 20 years from now, which are the electric vehicles, you know, in a very long period from now. So what is my fear today is that the work done by the European Commission doesn't match, you know, because there is the international combustion engine, which we have to finish, if we can say that, for those 200 and so millions of vehicles. And the European Commission is trying to write a document, a regulation for the new one, which is the electrical vehicle. And my fear is that there will be something there which doesn't match with regard to the objective, and we have to be very careful about that. And that's okay. That's my main concern today.
I think we have lost the moderator.
Yeah, we have lost the moderator.
Apologies, I am back. My internet decided that it didn't want to listen to your point, even if I did. Ms. Storstad, maybe we can come across to you next. What are your key takeaways from today?
Well, first of all, very good discussions. Thank you. I think, as I mentioned, the collaboration throughout the value chain is important. Also, the fact that our CO2 targets are sometimes, not aligned with the recycled plastics targets, which can be a problem. And I think that is important to remember when we're talking about regulating the recycled plastics. Even though I think it's important, we are very keen on using more in our cars, and we will. But just to remember that there are other requirements and that we're working with as well. But for sure, we're working on circular business models and using more plastics from cars in the future as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Katrikas, you'll be giving our final words, but is there something from the conversation and the debate that you want to raise now?
No, I will do it during the final wrapping up so that I don't take time from the other panelists.
Brilliant. We can raise the anticipation for that then. Mr. Otto, what are your key takeaways from today?
Thank you for this very interesting debate. I hear that there are interesting opportunities from today's debate, that from raising the bar and on the end-of-life vehicle directive together with the 3R type approval directive together and merging them. There are certainly challenges, but it's in the same time there are interesting opportunities to push forward design, to look at what can be done in terms of recycled content, and we hope that the European Commission will take on board that this is upcoming, and this is needed in terms of what is set for example, in the Circular Economy Action Plan. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. And Mr. Lowe, you have the honour of closing the Q&A session today. What are your takeaways from it?
Thank you very much. My takeaways today are that it's a very interesting discussion that we had today, that we face a lot of challenges. And one of them is that we have the combustion engine and we are coming up with electric vehicles, and the electric vehicle will certainly change also the different business opportunities of the OEMs, and also about the material flows and the material they will get back. We also have to see different regulations like the battery regulation, where you also have the circularity. That wasn't discussed today, but that's a topic that we have to have a closer look on when we are talking about circularity. But what we also see is that this is a challenge that none of us can do on their own. So there is a close collaboration needed in between the supply chain, the OEMs, and the recycling industry. And it has to be a fair burden sharing to come up with good results. And as you have seen from Volvo, the car industry is taking the topic of circularity really seriously and is working on those topics, because they are also a advantage if you want to sell a car, because a green car is a car that is also seen from the customers that will be bought. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lowe, and apologies if I paused again then. My Wi-Fi is not liking this today. That closes our debate today. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you to our audience for their questions. And
sorry.
Thank you all for your questions and for joining us. Thank you also to our panelists and our keynote speakers. Our closing remarks come from Emmanuel Katrikis, the Secretary General of EuRIC.
Okay, so can you hear me? Because I've lost, unfortunately, Kira Taylor. So if somebody can tell me that
it works. No problem.
Super. Okay. So I'd like to stress 3 different points. First, we know that with the European Green Deal and the new Circular Economy Action Plan, regardless of the legislation that are being revised, we are going to aim towards a much higher ambition. And while before we were solely looking at the efficiency of the system to collect and recycle or manage end-of-life cars, now we do have, and that is absolutely needed, a more holistic approach. More holistic approach as to how cars are being designed for the use phase, obviously, and here there is a major challenge with decarbonization that the car industry is taking upon. That is going to have an impact on the recycling industry, because we are completely changing of types of vehicles that are going to enter in the market. And as it has been said, at the same time, we are going to have to deal with the cars that have been marketed for the last decades, combustion engine cars, for which we do have an industrial capacity for a proper treatment, though more investments will be needed in the near future to be even more efficient. So I think just to make the transition, we need 2 things. First, we need, on one hand, more collaboration, and that is absolutely essential between, on one hand, car producers and car recyclers, and that will keep increasing. We also see the need for more collaboration between companies, because if Volvo or whatever other company is having, because all companies try to have a more circular agenda, that requires obviously to work with the recycling industry, since we do have the know-how as to how cars today and the future cars can be better recycled. And at the same time, to go a bit beyond the chicken and the egg dilemma, we need rules. And one of the rules that we saw was extremely actually powerful to make sure that we do scale up investments and at the same time reap out the benefits in terms of climate, resource efficiency, and energy savings, has been recycled content targets. And there are rooms for different materials for recycled content targets into the ELV revision. We discussed plastics. I've also mentioned tires. And I think this is absolutely essential to give the signal that the value chain do need to scale up in terms of investments for innovation, and also instead of investment to scale up the capacities. Point number two, I think we need more harmonization. Since all the companies across the value chains do have to make major investments, we need to have much better harmonization at European level in terms of how the ELV directive works. So that means better distinctions between ELV and used cars to avoid loopholes, an harmonized registration and the registration systems for cars, a better enforced certificate of destruction as well to make sure that there are no loopholes, and that the certificate of destruction, which is a key element in the system, is better enforced, and fight and tackle illegal, activities and illegal shipments, and at the same time make sure that the system is basically better enforced. And obviously bring, and I think that I try to stress that at the beginning, but I would like to stress it again, bring the insurance industry to be an active stakeholders within the enforcement of the ELV directive, because obviously they have a lot of information, a lot of data, and also a lot of power to better enforce the ELV directive. One thing we didn't have the time to discuss is activities, and especially sometimes illegal activities that are using online sales of valuable spare parts. We have come up with some proposals as EuRIC, so I won't be able to go a bit more into that. And so basically, just to conclude, I think we very much look forward to keep collaborating with the car industries, with NGOs as recyclers, to try to have a very efficient ELV directive, both in terms of better enforcement of the existing rules and at the same time in terms of much higher ambition to use more recycled materials back into cars, which is absolutely essential to achieve both Europe's circular economy and climate neutrality objectives. So thank you very much. Stay tuned. We will keep doing recyclers talks, and we'll keep advertising them on our website. And just as Kira Taylor has just said, I would like to extend a very warm thank to all speakers who joined today, representing different interests, and with whom we had, I think, a good open discussion as to a very important piece of legislation that is going to be revised. Thank you.